If you had smelled what I smelled on February 20th, 1945, you might stand here a little longer too. That's what I tell myself every time I walk into the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico and stop in front of the old flamethrower tank they keep on display, number 434, beaten, scarred and silent. I'm an old man now, well past my fighting years, but when I look at the welded seams, the dented armour and the dark burn marks along its steel hide, I don't see a museum piece. I see the shadow of the machine I commanded, number 431, the one that carried 5 young Marines across black volcanic sand and into a kind of fire no man ever forgets. My name is Staff Sergeant Robert Meza, United States Marine Corps, commander of Flamethrower Tank 431 at Iwo Jima. Most folks today hear that name and think of the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. But for those of us who were there, the memory runs deeper, heavier. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of ash and stone, turned into a fortress by men who were ready to die rather than give up an inch. And on that cursed island, 8 tanks like the one standing before me helped change the course of the battle and saved more Marines than we ever admitted out loud. Standing here now, I can almost taste the sulphur in the air again, can almost feel the grit of volcanic dust grinding between my teeth the moment the ramp dropped on that beach. The smell comes back first, the thick, oily napalm we carried, the smoke that clung to your skin, and beneath it all the sickening scent of burned flesh that no amount of scrubbing has ever washed out of my memory. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the distant echo of men shouting over the roar of engines and feel the vibration under my boots as 35 tons of steel rolled forward toward bunkers we couldn't even see. People walk past this tank quickly, uneasy, not wanting to imagine what it once did. I don't blame them. Most weapons kill clean compared to fire. But for us, for the boys who fought on that island, these machines were the thin line between going home alive and never going home at all. That's the truth of it, as plain as I can say. I was 20-something then, just a kid with stripes on his sleeve, trying to keep his crew alive while facing an enemy buried so deep underground we sometimes wondered if hell itself had opened beneath our tracks. Now, decades later, I stand here with grey hair and stiff knees, staring at a tank that looks too small to hold all the memories it carries, and every time I glance at that sealed barrel where the flamethrower once sat, I hear it again, the sharp hiss of compressed nitrogen releasing, the sound that marked the moment our world turned to fire on the black sands of Iwo Jima. A few months before we ever set foot on the black sands of Iwo Jima, I found myself standing in a cramped briefing room at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii, wondering why a tank crew like ours had been pulled off regular duty. Then Colonel George F. Unmacht walked in, a chemical warfare serviceman with the kind of face that told you he hadn't slept much, and he laid out a mission none of us had ever imagined. He told us 8 M4A3 Sherman tanks had been pulled aside, stripped of their main guns, and chosen for a secret conversion. The Navy Seabees and his chemical boys had built something new, something they called the CBH-1 system, and though we weren't engineers, we understood enough. This thing could throw a stream of burning fuel nearly 150 yards, driven by about 300 pounds of pressure, drawing from 290 gallons of thickened fuel and another 10 gallons of igniter mix. At full burn it could fire for around 80 seconds straight, though we were warned again and again to use only 2 or 3 second bursts unless we wanted to run dry at the worst possible moment. To an old man now, those are just numbers, but to the young Marines sitting in that room, it sounded like we'd been handed a monster. That was the day our crew truly became a crew. There was James Morrison, my driver, steady as a stone, Robert Chen, our bow gunner, small but quick and sharp as a tack, Corporal Anthony Vitelli, the loader who treated every gauge like it was a newborn, and Corporal Thomas Carlson, my gunner, who could see through a periscope like a hawk spotting a field mouse. And then there was me, Staff Sergeant Robert Meza, trying to look like a man who knew how to lead them into whatever this new weapon was meant to do. Training started the next morning, and it felt strange climbing into a Sherman whose cannon had been replaced by a stubby, ugly nozzle, but they'd rigged the controls so the flamethrower aimed through the same old 75mm gun sight, meaning Carlson didn't have to relearn how to hit what he was looking at. The Seabees kept the whole exterior coated in standard olive drab, just another Sherman to anyone watching from a distance, and that camouflage would matter more than any of us knew at the time. We weren't chemists, and we weren't inventors, we were tankers. We didn't need to understand every valve or mixture ratio inside that machine. We just needed to know that it could spit fire 3 times farther than a man with a portable flamethrower, and that if a Japanese shell ever punched through the wrong spot on our hull, 5 Marines would become a fireball before we even knew we were dead. That's what stuck with us. Not the technology, not the secrecy. Just the simple truth that we'd been given a weapon unlike anything we'd ever seen, and it would either save our lives or take them. Before we ever saw the black sands of Iwo Jima with our own eyes, we sat through a string of briefings aboard the transport ship. Listening to intelligence officers tell us the island was well prepared, though none of us truly understood what that meant. It wasn't until years later, when I was an old man reading declassified reports, that I realized just how much we hadn't been told. 21,000 Japanese soldiers were dug into that island under General Kuribayashi, a commander who understood he couldn't win but intended to make us pay dearly for every step. They carved more than 11 miles of tunnels into the volcanic rock. Plans had called for 17, some of them stacked 7 stories deep. They built 5,000 caves and underground chambers, some large enough to hold 300 or 400 men, and ringed the surface with 1,500 fortified positions, bunkers with 4-foot walls of concrete reinforced with steel ripped from abandoned construction sites. Looking back, it's almost laughable how confident we were. For 74 straight days, our bombers dropped 6,800 tons of explosives on that island, and the Navy followed with 22,000 shells. The brass told us the place had been softened up, that the Marines would take it in 5 days. 5 days. When you're young, you believe the men in charge know what they're talking about. But on February 19th, 1945, D-Day for Iwo Jima, we learned differently. Our flamethrower tanks rolled in with the 5th wave, mixed in among regular Sherman so the Japanese wouldn't spot us, and we were ordered to hold back until the situation became clearer. From inside the landing craft I could see the shoreline boiling with smoke and ash. The sand wasn't really sand at all, but deep, loose volcanic grit that swallowed boots and bogged down anything heavy. Marines dropped before they had gone 10 yards. Sherman tanks ahead of us took direct hits from guns we couldn't even see, disappearing in bursts of fire and red dust. The air shook with that strange mix of engine growl, exploding shells, and the muffled thud of bodies hitting the ash. We sat there in our 35-ton steel box, engines idling, waiting for the call to move, waiting to do the job we had been trained for, and yet all we could do was watch men fall while our radios crackled with casualty reports. And the hardest part, the part that still gnaws at me after all these years, is that we hadn't fired a single shot. The first time we were called forward, really called, came on the afternoon of February 20th, D+1, when Lieutenant Colonel William Duplantis came over the radio sounding like a man watching his line collapse. 2 rifle companies from the 21st Marines had already been torn apart, he said, and 3 concrete pillboxes were locking down a 200-yard kill zone that no one could cross. "Send the flame tanks," he ordered, and that was the moment our world inside 431 tightened to a single purpose. I remember the rumble of our Ford GAA engine as we pushed through ash so deep it climbed to a man's calf. The whole 35 tons of steel under us feeling like it might bog down at any second. Vitelli kept glancing at the pressure gauge, 300 psi and steady, while Carlson leaned so close to his periscope I thought he might crawl through it. At 125 yards, close enough to see the slits in the nearest pillbox, I gave the order, "Gunner, flamethrower, pillbox, fire!" What came out of that nozzle didn't sound like any weapon I'd ever heard. It hissed like the devil's own blowtorch, a roaring jet of thickened fuel that struck the firing slit dead on and poured inside. From where I sat, I couldn't see the men in there, but the infantry on the radio told us Japanese soldiers burst out the back only to fall within seconds. We traversed to the second pillbox just as a Japanese 47mm gun hit us square on the nose. The round ricocheted skyward with a scream, and the whole tank shuddered so violently that for a heartbeat no one said a word. Then Carlson fired again, holding the trigger for a long 15 seconds until black smoke gushed from every crack in the concrete like breath from a dying beast. The third pillbox was tucked behind a rock outcrop, and the only way to hit it was to close to 80 yards, far too close for comfort. As we crept forward, Japanese soldiers erupted from spider holes around us, rushing with satchel charges and magnetic mines. Chen tore into them with the bowgun, but a few slipped into the blind spot behind our tail. Before I could shout, Carlson spun the turret a full 180 and unleashed a wall of fire behind us so bright it lit the ash red. It was like watching the gates of hell swing open. When the flames settled, the assault line finally moved. The Marines of the 21st advanced 400 yards in 2 hours, more ground than they had gained in the previous 2 days combined, and for the first time since we'd landed I understood what Unmacht and his engineers had built. We weren't just another tank anymore. We were the weapon that bent the math of death on that island, the thing that could turn an impossible line of fire into a path forward. While we were fighting our way through those first pillboxes, reports crackled over the radio from every corner of the line, each one sounding more unbelievable than the last. Tank 434, working with the 23rd Marines near the East Boat Basin, had burned out 4 fortified positions in a single afternoon and stumbled onto a new way of moving, what the boys started calling corkscrew and burn, a slow spiralling advance that kept the flames sweeping across anything that might hold a gun. Farther down the beach, Tank 437 teamed with the 24th Marines and tried something different. They would hose down a bunker until nothing inside could breathe. Then the engineers rushed forward with demolition charges to finish the job. It was crude, violent, and terribly effective. And over with the 26th Marines, Tank 432 fired short bursts of flame upward, letting the burning fuel arc back down toward cave mouths. The Japanese defenders, believing the fire was about to pour in on top of them, ran out before a single Marine reached the entrance. We heard these things second-hand, listening from our own sector as shells hit the ground around us, and for the first time since landing, the news felt like the tide turning. That evening, the tally came in. 47 fortified positions destroyed across the front, Marines in flame-supported sectors suffering 40% fewer casualties than the day before, and more than 600 yards gained in areas that had been static for 2 days. Those were numbers none of us expected, not after watching the beach swallow men whole just 24 hours earlier. But the strangest reports weren't about damage at all. They were about fear. Patrols said Japanese soldiers were abandoning positions before the tanks even got close, slipping out the back tunnels rather than wait for the fire. In the Pacific we had learned to expect the enemy to fight to the last man, but that day something broke in them. And that was when it truly struck me. This weapon we carried wasn't just killing. It was reaching into the enemy's mind, snapping something deep inside. It was the first time any of us realized that the fire wasn't only burning through concrete, it was burning through resolve. By the 4th day of the battle, February 23rd, we were ordered toward Hill 382, the cornerstone of the entire northern defence, a place so deadly that the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines, had already lost 70% of its strength just trying to reach its approaches. Everyone knew the hill was the key, and everyone knew it was going to bleed us. That morning, 4 flamethrower tanks, including our 431, rolled out alongside regular Shermans and an infantry battalion. Before we'd gone far, Tank 433 took a 75mm hit that snapped its track clean off, but instead of abandoning the fight, the crew stayed in their crippled machine and kept firing, throwing sheets of flame to cover the rest of us as we pushed forward. Inside 431, it felt like trying to drive through the inside of a furnace. Ash blew across the field in thick waves. Artillery fell so fast it sounded like gravel being dumped on the roof, and poor Morrison could barely see 10 feet ahead through the periscope. Still we crawled upward, inch by inch, toward the bunkers carved into the volcanic stone. Then we ran into the enemy's newest trick. The first blast of flame splashed harmlessly off what looked like solid concrete, but through the smoke we realized the Japanese had mounted steel plates over the firing slits, opening them just long enough to shoot, then slamming them shut before our fire could get in. For a moment I felt my stomach drop. The weapon that had torn open the beach suddenly looked useless. But Corporal Michael Rodriguez, a gunner on one of the other tanks, spotted something the rest of us didn't. He noticed the steel glowing cherry red after each burst. If the flame held long enough, he said, the metal would warp. What he did next broke every rule in the book. He held the trigger down for 45 straight seconds, far beyond doctrine, nearly draining his tank's fuel, to force the temperature higher. Slowly the metal began to sag, then split, and once it did, the napalm poured through like water down a drain. The bunker erupted in a roar that shook the ash loose from our hull, and the blast exposed the hidden tunnel mouths behind it. Infantry surged forward immediately, hurling satchel charges into the openings before the defenders could regroup. 3 hours later, the outer defences of Hill 382, fortifications that had resisted everything thrown at them for days, were finally breached. But victory came with its own hard lessons. By the time the shooting stopped, 431 had burned through every drop of its fuel, 80 seconds of total flame, exactly what the manuals warned us about, and we had to crawl back for a 2-hour refuel. In that time, the Japanese could shift men, seal tunnels, or build new firing points, and there was nothing we could do about it. As I sat in the heat of the tank waiting for the next load of fuel, it dawned on me that our machine, as powerful as it was, wasn't invincible. It could break open a fortress, yes, but it couldn't hold the ground for us. It was a reminder that fire, even when it changes a battle, has limits, and so did we. There were places on that island where no amount of steel or horsepower could reach, and one of them was a narrow ravine the Marines called the Amphitheatre, a slit in the volcanic rock so tight our 35-ton monster wouldn't survive 10 feet inside it. All we could do from 431 was fire in support along the edges and listen to the radio as another man stepped into the kind of job no tank could do. That was the first time I heard the name Corporal Herschel Woody Williams. While we sat behind 3 inches of armour, Woody walked forward carrying a 70-pound M22 flamethrower on his back, with 4 riflemen covering him, 2 of whom would die doing it. For 4 straight hours he moved from one firing port to the next, burning out 7 pillboxes we couldn't even get close to. I remember sitting there in the turret thinking how strange it was that we were the ones with a machine that looked like hell's own furnace, yet it was that young man on foot who was taking the real risk. We could fire from a distance. He had to turn his back to the enemy every time he lit that thing. That day taught me something about the limits of steel and the courage of flesh. As we pushed farther north, the landscape itself became an enemy. Sulphur pits that steamed like open wounds, razor-sharp rock ridges, ravines twisting in ways a tank could never follow. Up there, we became something different. Instead of spearheading attacks, we acted like mobile pillboxes, parking in whatever space we could find and firing indirectly, bouncing streams of flame off rock faces to reach corners we couldn't see. And then came March 8th, the day Tank 436 pulled off what the crews later called the impossible shot at Cushman's Pocket. The Japanese had burrowed into a sheer cliff wall, safe from any direct flame. So the crew drove their tank up onto a mound of rubble left by naval bombardment, tilting the whole vehicle backward. That gave their flamethrower just enough elevation, 35 degrees turned into nearly 40, to arc the napalm high into the air so it fell straight down into the caves from above. When the flames poured in from the sky, defenders who believed themselves untouchable broke and ran or leapt from the cliff rather than burn. Watching that happen from our position, I understood something I hadn't quite grasped before. The tanks were powerful, yes, but they were only one part of a system that worked because every piece, infantry, engineers, riflemen, flamethrower men like Woody, carried a share of the burden. Fire won ground, but people won the battle. By the end of March, the battle had narrowed to a patch of ground barely 700 yards across, a twisted ravine the Marines called the Bloody Gorge, where the last 3,000 Japanese defenders waited in a maze of caves and cutouts. On March 21st, D+30, the order came down for every operational flamethrower tank to move in at once. The 6 surviving Shermans like ours, plus 4 newly arrived Ronson-equipped tanks with shorter reach. We had finally repaired 431's mangled track, so we were placed at the tip of the advance, while 433 rattled along beside us with a jury-rigged track that clanked with every turn. Tanks 434, 436, 437, and 432 formed a crescent around us, their guns angled to overlap so no shadow or fold of earth could offer shelter. When we moved, it was as if the entire front exhaled fire. Flame washed from tank to tank, overlapping in sheets so dense they looked solid, and the infantry followed 50 yards behind, tossing white phosphorus grenades to mark caves for us and handing off satchel charges to the engineers who would finish whatever the fire did not. The Japanese met us with the kind of desperation only men with no hope left can muster. Suicide squads burst from spider holes and charged with explosives strapped to their chests, but they never got close. The flame reached them first, turning their rush into a wall of fire. Anti-tank gun crews refused to run, Even when flames curled around their positions, they kept firing until they collapsed, burned where they stood. And then there was the officer with the katana, who ran straight for Tank 434 as if steel and willpower alone could carve through armour. The bowgunner hesitated, maybe out of shock or respect, and it was the Marines behind him who fired the shots that dropped the man only a few paces from the tank. By nightfall, the gorge was a furnace. 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead, most burned, some fallen to gunfire, a few by their own hands, and we had consumed 8,000 gallons of flame mixture, the highest single-day total of the campaign. Our own losses were heavy enough, 92 Marines killed, 257 wounded, but everyone knew it would have been far worse without the flame tanks leading the assault. Yet for me, it wasn't the numbers that stayed, it was the sound. The screams never lasted long. Fire ended things too quickly for that, but they were sharp, piercing, and they lodged somewhere deep inside, and it was the smell. The blend of burning flesh and sulphur from the volcanic rock, a smell that clung to our clothes, our gloves, even the seams of the tank. That night, sitting in 431 with the engine ticking as it cooled, I realised that victory had a weight all its own. We had broken the last fortress on Iwo Jima, but pieces of that day would follow me for the rest of my life. Iwo Jima was declared secured on March 26, 1945, 36 days after we landed on beaches the planners once said we'd taken 5. When the shooting finally stopped, the numbers told a story no after-action report could soften. 26,038 American casualties, 6,121 of them killed, roughly 20,000 Japanese defenders, and only 216 taken alive. More than 30% of the Japanese losses came from flame weapons, tank-mounted and portable alike. Just 8 flamethrower tanks fought on that island, yet together they consumed 360,000 gallons of fuel mixture, burned out more than 1,000 defensive positions, and according to the analysts who studied casualty patterns, kept an estimated 5,000 Marines from joining the list of dead or wounded. After the war, the work didn't stop. What began as a frantic project in a warehouse at Schofield Barracks grew into a full program. 354 flamethrower tanks were eventually produced. The Army converted the entire 713th Tank Battalion into a flame tank unit for Okinawa, where they burned through 200,000 gallons of fuel mixture fighting the cave complexes in the south. In Korea, the weapon proved its worth again, with flame tanks destroying nearly 300 Chinese positions during battles at the Punch Bowl and Heartbreak Ridge. But time and technology marched the same direction. By the 1970s, the M132, the last American flamethrower tank, was more relic than frontline tool, and when it was retired in 1978, newer weapons, thermobaric charges, precision-guided munitions, were already taking over the job of rooting out entrenched enemies. Sitting here now, an old man tallying figures most people never see, I realised the flame tank was never meant to last forever. It solved a brutal problem in a brutal war, and when the world moved on, so did the weapon. What stayed were the numbers, cold, hard, unyielding, and the knowledge that for a brief moment in history, fire shaped the fate of thousands. After the war, I went quiet for a long time. Men like me didn't talk about burning other men alive. We carried it like a stone in the pocket, heavy but unseen. Every few years, some of us from the flame tanks would meet in Hawaii, slipping back onto Schofield Barracks like ghosts returning to the place where our machines were born. By 2015, at the reunion held at the Marine Corps Museum, only a handful of us were left, grey and bent, standing around Tank 434, the way old sailors might gather around a ship that once carried them through a storm. But the moment that has stayed with me most happened long before that, in 1985, when I walked again onto the black sands of Iwo Jima, standing on the very ground where 431 first opened its flame. There I met Lieutenant Koshi Yamada, the man who had been on the receiving end. He looked at me a long time before he said, "I hated you for 40 years. War makes monsters of us all." I told him the only truth I had left. We were all just boys trying to survive. Now when I stand in front of Tank 434 at Quantico and watch schoolchildren file past, I hear them ask, "Why would anyone build a thing like this?" And in my heart, I answer them the way I answer you now. Not out of pride for what the fire did, but for the lives it saved. My crew, the Marines we walked alongside, the boys who got to go home because that terrible weapon cleared the way. I'm an old man now, speaking to other old American men who know what war really feels like, who understand that victory is never clean, and the tools that win a battle can scar a lifetime. Those tanks were proof that American imagination and industry could break the toughest fortress on Earth, but they also left a weight on the souls of the men who used them. So if you ever walk past that tank in Quantico, don't salute the steel. Salute the boys, on both sides, who burned for it.